How you doing?
I'm good. It's good to see you, Gary. How things?
Considering the state of the world, they could be better or worse.
Yeah, or worse. Are you still in California, or have you made the exodus like everyone else seem to be doing?
No, I'm one of these people who moved to California for the weather, so fleeing to Texas doesn't seem to be a solution for me. I think they're going to get there and remember that they moved to California for the weather. And,
probably so. Yeah, there's some of that. You can't bring the weather with you, unfortunately. Well, you got a new book. I guess it comes out in 2 days, if I'm not mistaken. Is that correct?
It does indeed. I got my first bad review today.
Oh, you did? Okay. Well, you know that's coming.
The London Sunday Times, somebody who God told him that it's all about calories, and so I'm not entirely sure he read the book, but
that's probably not. They probably saw your name on there and said, and automatically, you engender a lot of controversy, I guess, kind of as I do, but I think even more so from what you've done over the years.
Well, that's because people don't believe you exist.
Yeah, like I said, and by the way, we have a room full of it. How many of us are in here right now? We've got 30-some ghosts or cadavers or people that are reanimated corpses attending this meeting, that are
I want to know what's happening with Travis.
I don't know what's happening with Travis. Is he doing? Oh, he's got the fire behind his head. Well, he's probably in hell, most likely. He's probably phoning in from hell, most likely, is where all these meteors belong. So, hey, Gary, let me ask you. So, your new book, if I'm not mistaken, is called The Case for Keto, right? You did the case against sugar, the case for keto. You're doing a lot of legal proceeding analogies. Is that kind of how this one goes?
That is a legal proceeding analogy. Although originally this was called How to Think About How to Eat. And then it was going to be like a healthy weight manifesto or something like that. But then it turned out that David Katz and Mark Bittman, two very sort of media savvy purveyors of the conventional wisdom, had a book coming out a month before mine called How to Eat. So we had to change the title, and the publishing company liked the idea of getting the word keto in the title, since keto is viral now, and then they went for the legal thing. But I think it's a good way to discuss it, because basically it's a way to say, look, here's our side of the argument. So I'm not claiming that this is absolutely true, because part of your argument might be correct. I don't think so. So it's a way to discuss it that's a completely sort of honest and sets it out. Here's the argument, here's a defense argument in this case. I want people to understand why we believe what we do and why we find this way of eating and way of life so compelling. So,
yeah, I mean, the critics to whatever, whether it's keto or sugar being problematic or, your original, I mean, I've read all of your books as they entail about nutrition, good calories, bad calories, why we get fat, the case against sugar. And then I will read this one when I get a chance. But critics have been, there's been no shortage of critics, and they have, been very, I guess, aggressive in their criticism to some cases, and they'll say, hey, it's just about calories, and, it doesn't matter how much sugar you eat. Sugar is only problematic if you eat it in excess of calories. And I always sort of ask people, what's an excess of calories? And I say, well, if you get fat, then it's an excess of calories, right? I mean, but what does that mean, as far as how many calories you're eating? It seems like there's some more nuance to that. So I mean, I'm sure you've responded to your critics. I'm sure they're going to be the same critics that have been there. They're going to criticize this book. What is the preemptive counter argument?
Well, this is what's interesting is, I wrote this book to, I guess, convince the people on the edges, since the people at the extremes aren't going to pay attention. They're not going to listen. And even if they read it, they're not going to read it closely. I don't know if there is a count. To me, I have the same problem you do. The word excess calories or excess sugar, excess implies too much. Too much implies some physical harm has been done. It's a circular way of thinking about it. It's a tautology. You can't define excess without knowing whether the person is fat or not, or diabetic or not, or whatever this disease is supposed to cause, or the food or the drink or whatever that you're consuming is supposed to cause. So the word excess is completely tautological. So as is the word too much. It implies that you've already done harm. I don't find it at all meaningful, but if I have a conversation about this to one of the establishment researchers, and one of the advantages I have as a journalist is some of these people will still talk to me, about half of them. They look at me like I'm crazy. Literally what I'm saying doesn't make sense to them. And yeah, it's been, this whole thing is a lesson in sort of paradigm. Actually, even if you, I was saying before you guys got on that I got my first pan today. So my first review was very negative. It was in the London Sunday Times by a, pompous British journalist who just knows that it's all about calories and equated ketogenic diet to a celery diet. It was the kind of review I used to get 20 years ago. And technically, I wrote the book for him, and I clearly failed in the sense that nothing I said in the book convinced him that he wasn't right and I wasn't wrong. And because he's taking an established position, that makes him a defender of the establishment. He's very comfortable in his position. Then I become, I can't be a quack because I'm not a medical doctor. So, a whack job or a snake oil salesman. I don't know if there is a way to communicate it. Ultimately, it's in what's happening to people. And that's the point I tried to make in this book, that the reason physicians buy into this is not because they think I'm right about the logic or anything like that, but because their patients get healthier and they get healthier. Like you bought into this because you got healthier eating what you eat. So, and it's not subtle. There's nothing subtle about what happens to us. So it could be a placebo effect. Maybe the same thing would have happened if we were all vegans, but many of us were vegans, and then we eat like this and we get healthier. So it's an interesting study in cognitive dissonance and paradigms. And, I read the review in the London Sunday Times, and I started thinking, man, I'm just crazy. Maybe we're all crazy. Maybe there's just as many people out there who have gone vegan or to eat nothing but potatoes and have changed their lives just as much. And it's true that it's all about calories and the macronutrients have no effect. I mean, I don't think so, but how would we know if we were crazy?
Yeah, well, I mean, even if you use that sort of position as your framework, I mean, you still have to say, well, then there's appetite regulation. And, even if we said, every human gets 2,500 calories, and if you dare exceed that, you're going to get fat. Some foods are going to make it easier than others. I mean, there's at least that argument holds true. And then the other thing that always sort of kind of blows my mind is this: all calories are created equal, and then they sort of make this exception for protein. I mean, they're like, well, but protein has a 25% thermic effect, but we just don't even talk about that in the sense that, it kind of blows that calories in, calories out paradigm to some degree. I mean, that's clear.
Well, but the protein thing in the dietary induced thermogenesis is a technical term. That's still part of the calories idea. So they're willing to accept that. In fact, there are people who their way of, so there's sort of variations or different macronutrients have different caloric effects because of how many calories it takes to metabolize them or how much calories are lost. Like fiber has no calories because you don't metabolize it. And then there's, you go to what I'm arguing, which is just if you're thinking about in terms of calories in any way, you're not going to understand anything about fat accumulation. So it's no more, it's like, I had this conversation with a very well-known nutritionist at NYU because we were discussing a book she had blogged. This was just a couple months ago, and she had endorsed a book called What We Don't Talk About When We Talk About Fat. And it's by a young blogger who weighs 340 pounds, and it's about the burden of obesity and the insanity of being massively obese and about how people treat you and the biases, and it's a heartbreaking book. And at one point in the book, she talks about having tried all these diets and the diets failed her. And she says, look, some people are just built fat. They're just built fat. And then the question is, what is that about? It's not about how much dietary induced thermogenesis they get from the protein, or whether, they're eating too much of all foods. It's what physiologically drives them to accumulate fat when it doesn't drive us, or no longer drives us to accumulate fat. And that's an entirely different way of looking at it. That's what I mean when I talk about paradigms. It's a different paradigm. We're talking about why people get fat, not what regulates their appetite, although that's going to be related downstream, or how much energy they metabolize or don't metabolize, how much energy they need to metabolize their protein or not, because it's not about the energy content. It's about the effect of these macronutrients on hormonal regulation of fat accumulation, fat metabolism, carbohydrate. I mean, you said everyone treats it differently. I mean, protein has different. Sorry, I'm getting distracted by whatever Janice is doing. What are you doing? Hi, Janice.
Sorry. I'm straightening my arm. I apologize. I
think she's becoming a Cyberman.
No, I broke my elbow and I have to straighten my arm.
Oh,
Dr. Baker knows about this orthopedic device, right?
Oh, I had one of those. I had my knee replaced a couple years ago, and I spent like an hour and a half a day with my leg propped up and cranking that thing, and nightmare. I still have it on the stairs because they're expensive. They're like $3,000. They charge insurance $3,000 for them. I mean, it's insane. Okay, I was just checking that maybe there was some kind of workout technique that in your community I should know about. You strap something on.
Gary, I want to do, I mean, certainly I want to talk about, because keto, I mean, what I see in this community, I mean, weight loss is an issue for sure, but we see so many other things, conditions resolving with this carnivore-based diet, with ketogenic diets. But before we jump into that, I mean, you probably are aware, David Ludwig just did a meta-analysis review on metabolic ward studies or controlled feeding trials, and he came to the conclusion that if you go on a low-carb diet, after 17 days, I think was a cutoff, you see a 50 calorie per 10% reduction in carbohydrate. Critics of that say, well, he used doubly labeled water in some of those studies. And then I say, well, the average study that Kevin Hall looked at, these 29 studies, was 4 days. And I'm like, why are we looking at 4 days worth of data on average? What are your thoughts on that recent review? Does that give you any hope that there's something here? I mean, talk about protein, but again, there's carbs and fat that are also part of this equation.
But even when David Ludwig is talking about the energy expenditure, you've got two different hypotheses at work, right? So one of the comments I saw in response to David's thing is, well, even I thought it was like 130 calories a day.
That was average, yeah. But then he said if you looked at it, if you aggregate it was by per 10% reduction.
Yeah, but the idea isn't that because you're eating carbs that somehow revving up your metabolism. The idea is because you're not eating carbs. The idea is by keeping your insulin low, you're mobilizing the fat that you've stored. So you're burning that fuel because your body makes it available to you. It's not available when insulin is elevated. Now it's available so the extra energy expended is caused by the loss of fat from the fat tissue. So here's another way to think of the two hypotheses. One says you get fat out of your fat tissue by creating a negative energy balance, either increasing expenditure or decreasing intake. And you could increase expenditure by a dietary induced thermogenesis. Eating a lot of protein, for instance, would be a way to increase expenditure. The other hypothesis says the fat tissue is regulated. Fat doesn't just flow in and out because there's excess energy available in the bloodstream. The uptake of lipids into the fat cell and the lipolysis to get it out of the fat cell, that's all regulated primarily by insulin. So you lower insulin, you release fat from the fat cells, and your body will happily burn that fat for fuel if it's available and insulin is low. So one way you're getting fat or thin because of how you're manipulating energy balance. The other way you're getting fat or thin by how you're manipulating the hormones and enzymes that regulate fat, lipid uptake in the fat cells. So it's two entirely different ways of looking at it. The causal agent is different. And if you don't change the regulation of the fat cell, be said done in a second, then however you manipulate energy balance isn't going to make a damn bit of difference ultimately.
Hey, Gary, I mean, a lot of this stuff around insulin, I mean, certainly if you look at, say, diabetics and particularly, type 1 diabetics, if you go back into the literature from the early part of the 20th century, and I imagine some of the Austrians and Germans that you like to talk about probably were seeing some type 1 diabetics, and you have this clear, I mean, it is obvious, a diabetic that does not have insulin in type 1, just they waste away. I mean, they can eat 10,000 calories a day and they waste away. And then we have this concept of diabulimia, where we have these type 1 diabetics who don't take insulin just so they can lose body weight and body fat. But outside of that diabetic pathophysiology, does that same physiology hold up? Is it unique to illness that this is occurring, or do you think this is occurring in everybody at all times?
Well, this is why I don't know why you would assume it's unique to illness. So one of the, I was thinking about this last night, because the phrase I use in the book, the fat tissue is exquisitely sensitive to insulin. That's often the phrase that they use, metabolism research would use to describe it. If your fat cells, adipocytes, if there's any insulin in the circulation at all, they'll detect it and they'll hold on to fat that they've stored. So the insulin inhibits lipolysis. And lipolysis is necessary to get fat out of the fat. That's the first step in getting the fat out of the fat cells. In type 1 diabetes, you have no insulin. So they're seeing what in 1965, when Rosalind Yalow and Solomon Burson talked about, these are the two who invented the assay technique that allowed hormones to be measured in the bloodstream for the first time. And so for the first time, we realized that people with type 2 diabetes were not insulin deficient. They were actually hyperinsulinemic and had insulin resistant. And that was because Yalow and Burson had created the tool that allowed that. And they reported this in their first papers. So in 1965, Burson gives a Banting address at the American Diabetes Association meeting, and he just points out that for fat to come out of the fat cells have to see the negative stimulus of insulin deficiency. That's the phrase they use. So the negative stimulus of insulin, and it's interesting because when you think about what happens to a lot of people when they go on ketogenic diets, when they completely restrict carbohydrates, is very similar to what happens in type 1 diabetes, give or take the change in their appetite. They may not be voraciously hungry, but their fat tissue is now seeing insulin deficiency, and it's just dumping fat into the bloodstream. And it's almost as though you flick a switch. So you flip the switch from when insulin is present, you're seeing fat storage. And metabolism researchers throughout, like George Cahill, I'm sure you know because of his work on ketones. In 1971, Cahill gave a Banting address. I'm like pissed off about this because it's not in the keto book. I read it because my next book is about diabetes. And it's on insulin metabolism. And in this address, he says, this is the most respected metabolism researcher in the US in the 1970s. He's, Harvard. He's going on to become vice president, science director at the Howard Hughes Medical Institute. And he says, when insulin goes up, people store fat. And when insulin comes down, they mobilize and get leaner. And there's actually a peak when you plot it out, you could see the peak. There's a switch. And he says the more time they spend to the right of the switch, the fatter they're going to be. And the more time they spend to the left of the switch, the leaner they're going to be. And you could imagine us moving back and forth across that switch all day long. And then all night long, we're on the left side where we're mobilizing fat. And then at the end of his Banting address, he makes a comment about people getting fatter when they eat excess food. So he's got two different hypotheses. One is it's all insulin regulated, and it depends on how much time you're spending, in the zone of insulin deficiency. And the other one is people somehow magically eat too much because we live in this and we know that, fat people are gluttons. That's the essence of that argument.
Yeah, why didn't we have gluttons 200 years ago, Gary? I mean, presumably, was it just food availability, or what do you think was the difference? Well,
first of all, we had enough that this idea that gluttony causing obesity could grow. So Falstaff, right, and Shakespeare, big bearded guy with a leg of lamb in one hand and a tankard of ale in the other, and the assumption is that's why he's huge, right? Because he eats too much. He's a glutton. So gluttony and sloth cause obesity. They wouldn't have, if they didn't have obesity, they would not have made gluttony a sin. But then, and this is a sugar argument, then the Industrial Revolution comes along. You get refining of flour. You get sugar goes from being a luxury to being the cheapest food available. Sugar consumption goes up, from 5 pounds per capita to 90 pounds per capita in the 19th century. You get the formation of the candy, chocolate, ice cream, and then soda industries, all from the 1840s to the 1880s. And when you look at diabetes rates, diabetics start to appear in hospitals coincident with the creation of the sugar candy. And, then once the soda industry kicks off, the numbers start to shoot off. You also see an increase in vegetable oil, although I don't find that science all that compelling. So to me, it's you add sugar and flour and you start seeing obese, and you start seeing insulin resistance, probably because of the sugar. And once you start seeing insulin resistance, you're going to start seeing mothers who are insulin resistant during pregnancy, and now you're going to start programming children to be insulin resistant, obese and diabetic as they get older. And that programming is going to happen in the womb, and now you're going to you're seeding the conditions for an epidemic. Each successive generation is going to have more and more of this. And part of being insulin resistant is craving carbohydrates, because when your insulin levels are elevated, you're burning carbs for fuel. It won't allow you to burn fat for fuel. The malonyl-CoA pathway to the mitochondria is sort of driven towards glucose usage. So not only are you creating people who are predisposed to get fatter and diabetic as they get older, you get predisposing people to crave the carbohydrates that are going to make them fatter and diabetic as they get older. So to me, that's what happened, or that's the simplest possible hypothesis. Whether it's right or not, there's no way to test it.
But the thought that, by refining these flours and sugars, they become hyper absorbable relatively. If you had to crunch through an apple or eat an unrefined grain, you would have all this stuff that would interfere somewhat with the energy absorption. Does that sound?
Well, that's true, but that energy absorption has effects on blood sugar, so the glycemic index, right, which affects pancreatic insulin secretion, then the hyperabsorbability of fructose is going to affect how the liver's ability to metabolize that fructose. And the sort of preponderance of evidence suggests that insulin resistance starts in the liver with hepatic insulin resistance. So, to me, as I said in the sugar book, I think I could get an indictment on sugar and sugary beverages being the primary cause of insulin resistance, and so the obesity and diabetes epidemics. I couldn't get a conviction because we don't have the randomized controlled trials necessary to really test the hypothesis. On the other hand, if you went to the federal government and said, give me $50 million so I could test whether sugar is toxic, and I want to randomize 10,000 people to consume, this standard American sugar consumption, another 10,000 to abstain from sugar, and run it out for 10 years, they would say, we don't have to do that study. Everybody knows that people who don't consume sugar will be healthier. So.
Well, but that's, if that's common sense or considered, I see a lot of people that disagree with that. They'll say, sugar is only detrimental in excess. I mean, they completely say it. And there's some studies that sort of allude to that. There's meta-analysis that say that it's unknown and that type of thing.
Yeah, no, I know. I'm just saying that if you really wanted to do the study, to get the money to do the study, the government would acknowledge that. But they would say that the people who abstain from sugar would be healthier because they would be consuming less calories. So there's a way to turn it into calories. But remember, as soon as you said, sugar's only deleterious in excess, we went back to our tautological thinking. Everything is deleterious in excess by definition of the word excess. So, breathing too much is bad for you in excess, because we've already used the phrase too much to say somehow we've done more than is good for us. Doesn't get you very far.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. Let's talk. So
let me ask you one question.
Sure, go ahead, Gary.
Okay, because, we've met. I was telling my wife yesterday about my feeble attempts to compete with your rowing times, and how much better I felt when I met you in person and realized that there was a slight size advantage, and musculature advantage. You probably outweigh me by 40 pounds. Okay,
yeah,
we do not think.
I'm 255 right now, so I don't know what that.
And I'm about 208.
Yeah, so about 50 pounds. Yeah, just about. Yeah.
It's muscle, not fat. So we don't think of it in terms of, we don't care about any of the thermodynamic effects of the foods we're consuming. Okay, but clearly, if it was fat, we would be able to say, well, you ate too much, or you weren't getting enough, somehow they weren't expending enough energy. But as soon as we talk about muscle or height, or even if you didn't have the musculature but were just 20 pounds heavier than me because you had the height, we don't care at all about thermodynamics. We know it's purely hormonal, growth hormone, insulin-like growth factor, things like that. That the calorie question never gets into it, even though your appetite is probably considerably bigger than mine. And my appetite is much. I started talking about this nutritionist. I was having this discussion with at New York University, and she copped to the fact that she's a big believer in calories, and she said her father was obese and he died young, and he ate tremendous amounts of food. And I said, but you and I have gone to dinner together. I eat tremendous amounts of food compared to you. And that when we got up from the table, I took her to dinner once at this wonderful Italian restaurant in Greenwich Village to thank her for helping on an article. And I said, when we got up from the dinner, I was still hungry. I could have eaten 2 or 3 of those, and you were pleasantly satisfied. And the reason I eat more than you are is because I'm twice your size, right? That your father was also twice your size. Why do you blame his obesity on overweight, on eating too much? So that's the thing. It's why make that kind of, we know in other growth phenomena, it's always hormonal, and that how much we eat is determined by how big we're growing or how big we are. And then in obesity, we turn it around and say how big we are is determined by how much we eat or exercise. And there's just no reason to differentiate the two like that.
Yeah, I mean, those are obviously good points. And again, the tautological argument of too much is too much, and it's kind of a dumb argument. So I mean, it's I see this all the time within this community. People will swear up and down that they are eating more food than they ate before, and yet they're not gaining weight. In fact, some of them actually lose some weight. And I always say, look, you're eating more protein. Perhaps you're stimulating less insulin. Perhaps you're feeling better and you're starting to be more active. I mean, there's a lot of things going on with that. But let me. So the book, I want to make sure we talk about the book some more. But keto, I mean, that is as much as it is a buzzword and perhaps sells more books type of thing, it's becoming more difficult to define for some people. Like if I say I'm on a ketogenic diet, it could mean corn oil and Diet Coke. I mean, so what are your thoughts on a ketogenic diet? Okay,
well, one of the things I tried to do is simplify this. And again, this is my perspective. So my simplification is, a ketogenic diet is a diet that you abstain from carbohydrates and replace it with fat for the most part. It is true that you could do that. You could guzzle vegetable oil, I assume, but as soon as somebody starts playing those kinds of games, I'm not that interested in the discussion we're having, right? So I just wanted to get across to, again, the people I'm writing to, which are let's say 2% of the 1% of the population has bought into what we're selling and is abstaining from carbs and eating something on the range from low glycemic index diet to South Beach to Carnivore on, your extreme. And I want to get the people who are next to them, the 10 or 20% of the paid population that's thinking I have to solve the obesity, my obesity or my diabetes, and my niece Janice went on this keto thing, and I'm thinking of trying it, but my doctor tells me it's going to kill me. So basically, I wrote a book for that person and for him or her to give to their doctor. And now we're just, again, in an ideal world, in the book, I say I'm going to use the phrase, and I do throughout, low carbohydrate, high fat / ketogenic eating, or LCHF/keto for short, because I want to capture this whole range of eating behavior. I don't know how important it is, frankly, to be in ketosis. So one of the things I did for this book, I interviewed over 120 physicians who have transitioned to our way of thinking. I figure there's a few tens of thousands out there, and I talked to 120 of them. And every one of them I said, do you care about ketosis? So these are people who prescribe, keto, for lack of a better word, to their patients. And I said, do you care that they're in ketosis or not? And effectively, none of them did. They wanted to get their patients off sugars, grains, starches. And they thought if they can get them off sugars and grains, starches, and they weren't showing any health benefits, then they could look for ketones as a way to check whether or not they're telling them the truth about their diet. So if they're not in ketosis, they probably have either some confusion about what they're allowed to eat, or they're not doing what they're lying to them. But other than that, they just wanted, again, they knew that if they can get them off sugar, starches, and grains and accept healthy fats, however we want to describe that, then they can make their patients healthier, and their patients would stay healthier, and their patients would have more energy, and they'd have the energy to be physically active, and all these other things that associate with good health. So, how you define ketosis, whether it's 20 grams a day or 50 grams a day. I've had discussions with Steve Finney for, going on probably 15 years now about how important it is in terms of the, cognitive acuity to be in ketosis. Like, do I spend much of my life in a brain fog because I'm not in ketosis, or because I haven't taken a day off from work in 45 years? So and those issues, there's a lot of different opinions. I tried to discuss a range of opinions without making too many, I would let people know where my bias lies. But I don't know what the truth is. Same with the level of protein. Is this a high protein diet? Is Ted Naiman right that we should be eating more protein and less fat? Or is virtually everyone else right who are following ultimately, what Atkins prescribed one way or the other, where it should be a high fat diet? And I lean towards high fat, but Ted's a compelling guy.
Yeah, and I appreciate Ted, and I certainly am a protein advocate for an amount of adequate protein. I think some people are out there advocating extremely low protein diets, which I think is probably not helpful. Let me ask you, Gary, because obviously you look into the science, and ultimately, depending on how good you think the science is, that's what's ultimately going to sway the needle, I suppose. But when I look at, say, if you look at a zookeeper and they're going to figure out how to feed the zebras, they don't go to the grocery store and try to figure out what they're going to feed zebras. They look at what the native diet of a zebra might be. I mean, do you think it's even worth trying to attempt to infer what a wild human diet might be, based on the anthropological evidence, or is it just too impossible to infer from that?
Well, again, the advantage with zebras is they live in a very, relatively limited ecosystem, where I assume their diets from north to south and east to west of their range are pretty similar. Unfortunately, or fortunately, humans spread out around the globe, so you have all kinds of ancestral diets.
Let me give you another analogy. Let me give you wolves. Wolves are the second most diverse animal on the planet as far as range, only exceeded by humans.
Okay, well, and clearly we think alike, but I think there's two ways to look at this also. You could say, what was the original Paleolithic diet. What did the human companions to the wolves ate? And we should all eat that. And if we eat that, we'll be as healthy as humanly possible. Or we can accept that there was a range of ancestral human diets, which there seems to have been, clearly, at least for the last 500,000 years, say, as humans spread out over the planet. And they ate what was available, and they adapted to what was available. And then you ask the question, what has changed so recently to explain the explosive increases in prevalence of obesity, diabetes, and then the diseases that associate with them, like heart disease and cancer and dementia. And so what I've basically done is assumed that what we know for sure is that none of our ancestors ate sugar, white flour, and you have plenty of observations of populations that transition from whatever their traditional diet is to eating diets with sugar and white flour added, and their health goes to hell. So let's get rid of those, and let's get rid of, and we're safe saying that. Would we all be healthier if we all ate like wolves? Possibly. That would be a very wonderfully interesting study to do. But I'm not sure it's true. And clearly there are people in our community, in the low carb keto community, who swear that they can't tolerate animal products. Although maybe if they ate nothing but animal products for 3 months, they'd find their body tolerates them wonderfully. So it's sort of, I'm trying to maximize what we know in a way where there are clinical trials also to say that it's, that's clearly safe and beneficial, and then be honest about everything we don't know. So one of the things I say in the book is anyone who tells you that their way of eating is going to make you live longer is selling something, because we've never done the experiments to confirm that hypothesis, no matter how compelling that hypothesis may be.
Yeah, I have to say, like these longevity gurus or longevity experts, they never seem to offer a money-back guarantee, and they don't have any results that would be compelling.
I mean, it's a wonderful idea to offer a money-back guarantee because you can't lose your money, right?
Exactly, yeah.
I mean, they should probably do so, and you should patent the idea before it's too late.
That might be something to do. Money-back guarantee, if you don't live to be 100, I'll be there to pay up, starting in 2025 or something like that.
And the small print says you don't get to, your next of kin can't cash this guarantee in. Okay, you're the only one who could do it.
What about, hey, Gary, let me ask you, I don't know if this book talks about this or not. The microbiome has taken on just an enormous amount of import, or whether warranted or not. Do you have any input on does the microbiome, does a ketogenic diet impact it good, bad, indifferent? Do we know enough? Is it just fool's errand?
Getting two answers. The first is one of the small studies at NUSI. So NUSI, the Nutrition Science Initiative, not-for-profit that Peter Attia ran and Peter and I co-founded, one of the studies we funded was this infamous Energy Balance Consortium, in which Kevin Hall was one of the two principal investigators, and they transitioned people from a standard American diet to a ketogenic diet. And one of the sub-studies we funded was a study of the gut biome as it transitioned from the standard diet to keto. And that paper was published, I think, in this past year. And the gut biome, by almost all definitions, was better on the ketogenic diet than on this, what was a healthy standard American diet. And by healthy, I mean it had a relatively low sugary beverage content. That said, when I was growing up, when I was in my salad days, as a journalist, I was doing books on physics. The best physicists I know used to describe the front lines of science as like little kids playing soccer. So, like preschoolers. They kick the ball over here and everybody runs after it. And then they kick the ball over there and everybody runs after it. And if you're just watching where the ball's going, you would have no idea where the goals are. And if you're just watching where the kids are going, you'd have no idea. They're just chasing the ball. And to me, the gut biome is the ball. We failed to solve obesity because we thought it was an energy balance problem, and we decided the endocrine system had no say in how much fat was accumulated, and then it became a molecular biology field with leptin, and so the medical community's completely failed to solve it, and now the gut biome comes along, and there's something they've never studied before, and they have the tools to study it so they could learn revolutionary things. And there's a lot of assumptions that, hey, maybe this is a secret. Can we find something that can say this is why we failed to explain obesity, diabetes, the epidemics, why we can't cure anyone? And there could be important things to learn, but at the moment it's just a frenzy. It's just where the ball's been kicked and the kids are running, and if they don't learn anything, there's no goal there. 5 or 10 years from now, the ball will be kicked in a different direction. They'll run after that. There's just no way to tell.
Gary, let's say, you say we failed to solve obesity because we're thinking maybe the wrong way. But let's say if we could, scientifics would say absolutely prove what you're saying, perhaps what I'm saying is correct, and that is a solution. Is it really a solution? Is it even achievable? If we even knew it, if everybody said, hey, I know just eating a steak and eggs diet is going to get me to lose weight, and I'm going to reduce my insulin and my glucose is going to improve, and that's clear as day. Does that even matter if we know? Is it going to change?
Well,
Can we convince people?
I think we can convince people. My assumption has always been that part of the failure is the way we thought about and the way it's been communicated in the understanding of the scientific community. And that if people understand, and I don't think about it as eat bacon and eggs, right, and steak for lunch and, pick your animal for dinner. I think of it as carbohydrates are fattening. So if people understand that carbohydrates are fattening and that's why they get fat, then I think more and more people will figure out a way to stop eating them, such that they could maintain a healthier weight. And maybe we would do the experiments necessary with women when they're pregnant to figure out if we can sort of reset this intergenerational phenomenon I discussed about, the intrauteral effects. I work on the assumption that knowledge is power, which is sounds like something out of 1984 and might be, which is a little frightening, but that if we empower people with the correct understanding and if the community understands it. When we were at NUSI, we used to talk about there being a default knowledge environment and a default food environment. So you had to fix the default food environment, which is all the foods that are so easy to eat and, displayed so prominently in the supermarket. But you also had to fix the default knowledge environment, which is it's not about calories. All calories aren't created equal. You don't get fat by eating less, and you don't lose weight by eating less and exercising more. It's the problem are the carbohydrates, and you've got to get those out of your diet. And if everyone understands that, and so every child, burdened with obesity is living in a community where his teachers understand that and his school friends understand that and he does and his parents do and his guidance counselor and his physician and the insurance agents and everyone, I think the world starts to get healthier. Does it take 100 years? And by that time, do we have some drug to fix it? Maybe, but I doubt it.
Here, what do you think about, we've had for the last, 50 years in medicine, we've kind of had this know your number, know your LDL cholesterol, your blood pressure, and some of these things, your body weight. We've got this new technology, CGMs, and my understanding is China can crank them out for about $10 a pop. If we were to strap a CGM on 50% of the population, and it became ridiculously affordable, and all the doctors got on board and said, hey, keep your blood sugar under 140 postprandially and keep it under 100 fasting, would we solve things?
I think that would help. I think CGMs will. Well, again, I'm in a biased world because I'm talking to people who have already sort of bought into low carbohydrate thinking. So they think if everyone with diabetes in the world used a CGM, they would change the way they ate. But people with diabetes have an advantage, right? Because, or a disadvantage. They're sick, they have to take medication, they have to, many of them have to inject themselves with a very potent drug multiple times a day. They're being told that their lifespan is, 10 or 20 years shorter. If they're men, there's all kinds, the erectile dysfunction is in their future. They have much greater motivation to get healthy than somebody who's just 20 or 30 or even 50 pounds overweight, but feels healthy day to day as it is and is happy with the way they eat. The implication of, like, for instance, this reviewer in the London Sunday Times, the assumption is, even if I knew this to be true, it wouldn't be worth it because I want to keep eating my donuts and drinking my beer. And a lot of people are going to feel like that one way or the other. There's some significant portion of the American public still smoke cigarettes, and they know that it's going to kill them when they start smoking. They don't start smoking without the knowledge that this is likely to be bad for them. So, just is what it is. I always say our job is to do the best we can. And the more people who shift, the more the social environment begins to pressure people to shift as well. It becomes less socially acceptable. When everyone suffers from obesity or diabetes, then there's very little pressure to fix it. But when you feel like you're the only one, and again, I could imagine bad things. Knowledge, it's like any intervention, is going to cause negative consequences as well. Some people are going to be vilified or condemned for being overweight or diabetic, even though they shift the way they eat, because it doesn't fix it. And then the assumption will be that they're out there eating donuts when they're not, But I don't know. It'll be interesting to see. It'll be an interesting experiment.
In your other books, and I read what was available on Amazon, a little excerpt, and you talk about Atwood, and I always appreciate that you go back historically and you look at all these, you tell these stories of this, historical importance. But do you think, in researching, and even in your next book, do you think there's some degree of malevolence or malfeasance within the scientific community or the food industry, that they knowingly are basically killing people? Is that something you've kind of uncovered? Or, I know we've talked about the sugar companies paying Fred Astaire out and all this stuff.
Well, I also think there was a line I threw in the sugar book from this guy who had designed an advertising campaign for one of the sugary cereals. I forget which one. And a reporter supposedly asked him if he would let his kids eat that. And he said, "Are you crazy and eat an insulin shot just to eat that cereal?" On some level, I think they were. I don't think that. I'm not a big believer in conspiracy theories. That people are knowingly advocating something that they know is dangerous to the public. I tend to think most people are like me, but there are people out there who would accuse me of basically just writing bullshit that'll kill people to make money. So, but no, I think it's sort of cognitive dissonance. You grow up with these ideas, everyone and groupthink. So everyone believes the same way you do. Everyone everyone in the food industry believes that these are benign foods. The nutrition, obesity community says, hey, it's all about calories. Nobody's producing anything toxic. It's not like cigarettes. It's just, I'm kind of curious why the government, like the NIH, isn't interested. And at one point, I actually had a conversation with Francis Collins, the head of the NIH, about this, and sent him a copy of Good Calories, Bad Calories. And he seemed like a very thoughtful man who would want to do something. But if they go to their own experts, so you imagine this, you manage to convince the guy in charge. We had this issue with Newsty when we were trying to raise money. So you convince the billionaire that there's something to the argument that you're making. if nothing else, we have to do much better studies to find out who's right. So we know what advice to give. And the studies, if we spend $500 million, that's a half a day's cost of the diabetes in America. I mean, clearly that's worth it. And the billionaire goes, yeah, that's really interesting. I completely get it. Let me think about it. And then as he thinks about it, he's going to ask his advisors. And his advisors are going to go to the experts. And the experts might be somebody from the Cleveland Clinic or the Mayo Clinic or, Cornell Medical School, and they're conventional wisdom people. That's how they became well-known expert authorities. They think, so they're the people we're saying are wrong. So then what they tell the billionaire advisor, they tell, Francis Collins at the NIH is, look, these people, they're like anti-vaxxers or creationists or, they could make an argument that sounds compelling for 10 seconds, but it's just not worth pursuing. And so they let it drop. And so you're constantly fighting the fact that everyone in the establishment tends to think the same way, and they get endless feedback that they're right because everyone they know, everyone they like, everyone they respect thinks just like they do. That's the essence of groupthink, by the way. The people we like and respect are the people who think like we do. That's why we like them so much. And that's why we think they're smart, because we all agree. So it's it's just a very slow process, and it's probably never ending. And then when it shifts, right, it'll shift and they'll say, we knew it all along. They were still wrong. We're not going to think like they've been telling us to think, but they were wrong and we knew it all along. And then it'll go on from there.
Well, I mean, it's just the whole science progresses one death at a time, basically. But English is now, I guess, the de facto language of science. Previously, it was maybe French, and you talk about the Germans. And I mean, is the whole world on the same page right now? I mean, I have no idea what the Asian literature is, and I don't know if you could translate it. But do you know if what we think in the United States and the other English-speaking countries is the established thought about dietary dogma currently?
I assume it is for the most part. There are slight differences in the countries I know about. But yeah, the Americans post-war, with the vacuum in any research being done in Europe, the U.S. research community sort of took the lead. And everyone followed from what. So our guidelines were copied elsewhere, or even if they put together authoritative groups, the authorities were the people who tended to think like the Americans. When doing the research for Good Calories, Bad Calories, I actually interviewed some German researchers who had studied ketogenic diets in the 1970s and into the 1980s. And then Dean Ornish came out with his papers in JAMA, and they looked at those and they said, oh, well, we must be wrong. Dean must be right, or he wouldn't be published in JAMA. And then they just shelved their research and went and did something else. So I think it's a safe bet. There's some countries, the English seem to be more open to the low carb community and the arguments of people like us. And I think it's because maybe they don't have quite such an active, vegan movement. So there's more of a vacuum where it's not an immediate conflict when you start telling people they should eat more, or eat meat at all, where the way it is here. My books are translated in a lot of countries, not Germany, which is interesting because I keep trying to get the Germans to understand that, they actually solved the problem and they just didn't realize it, or the war came along and they got derailed. The Asian communities are behind us in obesity and diabetes rates, so it's not yet this important, but China and India are probably going to explode with obesity and diabetes in the coming generation, and they'll have to solve it. And hopefully, they'll be open to this now. Certainly a lot more people are open, but, and I'll give you another example. I interviewed this, winter. So I've been arguing, right, that the energy balance thing is a tautology. It's meaningless. There's a famous physicist named Wolfgang Pauli who would have said it's not even wrong. It's like thinking about obesity is caused by positive energy balance is like thinking about wealth as being caused by positive money balance. You make more than you spend, therefore you get rich. It doesn't tell you anything. So I was working on a New York Times Magazine story that because of the way the world changed in the past 9 months, they decided not to run, and now I'm trying to place it elsewhere. But I found one well-respected Danish researcher who has also been arguing in his papers. And by well-respected, he's got 400 publications. He's collaborated on major international collaborations with leading obesity researchers in the US and throughout Europe. He considers many of these people as friends, like Kevin Hall's a friend of his. And he's been arguing that energy balance is absurd. Tautology doesn't tell you anything, completely the wrong way to discuss it. And he's written this in a couple of papers. And he told me, even though he's in Denmark and he's a leading obesity researcher, that over the years he's kind of learned not to discuss it with any of his colleagues because they look at him like he's crazy. And then he has to explain to them, I'm not denying the laws of thermodynamics. I'm just saying they're not relevant to this question. And he says exactly what I say. It's like the exact same phenomena, even though we're living in, very different cultures. I'm in Northern California and he's in Copenhagen. It's no different. So,
Gary, how important, there are studies out there now where they intentionally have people maintain their body weight. They feed them enough so that they're weight stable, comparing low carb to standard carbohydrates, and we get differences in different variables, glycemic numbers, inflammatory numbers. Is that relevant? I think it's very relevant personally, but what are your thoughts on that? Outside of this weight loss, because of weight loss, I get tired of doing the weight loss stuff. I'm more interested in are they no longer diabetic? Do they have an autoimmune disease anymore that requires medication, so on and so forth? But do you get into that with keto at all? Because I've seen just so many people with depression and so many other issues get better.
Well, I didn't get into it in this book, but I'm fascinated by those studies also. But again, for a slightly different reason. So Jeff Volek published one maybe 2 years ago now, showing that there were improvements in all metabolic risk factors while keeping weight stable. And he controlled for calories. So he controlled for the same calories, which is why he said he knew he was keeping weight stable. And I read this paper and I emailed my colleague, Mark Friedman from NUSI, and David Ludwig. And I said, Jeff Volek just claims to have confirmed the Kevin Hall Energy Balance Consortium study. Okay. I don't know if Kevin ever noticed this. I'm pretty sure Jeff didn't notice this, but the design of the study was very similar without the metabolic ward. And the result they were claiming was the same. So I don't believe you can switch somebody from, say, 2,500 calories, of which 50% are carbs, to 2,500 calories, of which 5% are carbs and 80% fat, without weight loss. Okay, right? Because now we get that negative stimulus of insulin deficiency, you're going to get weight loss. Jeff had claimed to have done that. And so all those studies often claim to have done that. They're usually very short term. They're usually assuming weight stability because they've assumed caloric, isocaloric diets. But anyway, David Ludwig then reached out to Jeff and asked him to reanalyze the data because the way they analyzed it, there actually could have been weight loss over the beginning and end of the diet period. They just looked at the midpoints of both diets. And unfortunately, Jeff was very busy and never got back to him. But if I was Kevin Hall, I would have played this study up and said, look, this confirms what we said all along, which is that a calorie is a calorie, except not on weight, not on risk factors. On risk factors, clearly you're going to get a major difference. If you don't, you'd have to wonder what's going on. Like, why would you not get a difference if you're feeding carbs versus fat versus protein differently? Because your body's should respond to them differently, right?
Yeah, that would be the assumption there. What historically, I guess, in your research in your new book, there were. I looked into some of the diabetes historical stuff. It's interesting. There's a guy, University of Well, I mean, there's an Italian guy named Cantini, Rollo was I think a Scottish guy. I mean, they're using these meat-based diets, and we had Louis Newberg, University of Michigan, in 1920, before insulin was invented. He was in a battle with Jocelyn, I guess, and he was on a very much a high-fat diet, and he was saying, he was taking these type 1 diabetics that were almost dead, septic, had all kinds of disease, and he was basically getting them essentially euglycemic and recovering, and they were able to live, basically relatively normal life without it before insulin was available. Did you look at any of that? Have you looked at any of those guys?
Well, again, for the diabetes book I'm doing, I've become obsessed with that history too. Again, it's fascinating, and that'll all be in this diabetes book, which I hope to get written in the next 9 months if I make more progress than I made in the last 2 months. The idea that the animal diet, they called it, was sort of the Inuit diet, it was often called, was standard of care, effectively around the world pre-insulin. And yet Newberg came along. So the same guy who I'm blaming for getting obesity all wrong appears to have gotten diabetes right, which is, inconvenient, but it is what it is. Inconvenient from the storytelling perspective. It's interesting. I got caught up in this chapter where I keep wanting to talk about homeostasis and how complex the hormonal regulation and endocrine nervous system regulation of the human body is. And so if you've got a problem where your pancreas isn't secreting insulin, while you could get rid of the immediate symptoms by injecting insulin into a vein or an artery, you can't, this complex homeostatic system is going to be permanently perturbed in a way that's going to end up with the complications that they saw afterwards. So one of the fascinating stories with diabetes is, used to be type 1 diabetics, died within weeks or days, hours to, a couple of years of diagnosis. And then you get insulin, you could keep them alive long enough to start getting complications. And by the mid-1930s, you're seeing massive, this epidemic of kidney failure, blindness, retinal hemorrhages, and then heart disease. And the diabetes community is struggling to understand it. That's what's so fascinating. And they don't want to believe it's caused by the insulin. And simultaneously, they've had people arguing for what they called liberal diets. So Jocelyn thought diet, because of his friendship with Frederick Allen, he thought the goal of diet should be for undernutrition, for people not to gain weight. So you don't starve them. But if they're gaining weight, you got to feed them less. And then Newberg was arguing for these high-fat diets where you can basically feed them ad libitum and they won't gain weight anyway. And then other physicians started saying, look, our patients don't want to be on diets. They just want to take insulin. And they're not going to be on diets anyway. So let them just eat what they want. And we'll cover it with insulin. And they seem to do fine. Some of them seem to need slightly less insulin per carb consumed. I'm a little confused by their numbers. When you let them eat liberal diets, a lot of carbs, they somehow could handle a little less insulin. But then you start getting this epidemic of complications. And now you've got to explain that. And that's where maybe the best way to deal with a perturbed homeostatic system is to remove the source of the perturbation rather than replace what's broken. If you get rid of carbs, the body doesn't need the insulin that it can secrete, or not nearly as much.
Yeah, would you say that insulin is uniquely damaging, or is it the food that is causing you to secrete the insulin, which is the damaging part? I'm just kind of.
I think it's both. And there are people, again, there are very good people who argued both, that insulin is atherogenic. And I tend to think, even when we get into discussions about LDL and, LDL particle number and the Dave Feldman type of arguments, I'm very insulin. I think even the arteries aren't going to take up LDL particles, or they don't just get trapped in there because they bounce against the walls and you have more of them to get bounced up. They basically have to be invited in, and that's going to be an insulin related phenomena. And it could be why high LDL would be, or high LDL particle number would be completely benign if you keep your insulin low. So, and like I said, they're very good people like Ralph DeFranzo at UT Southwestern, who made arguments that insulin itself is atherogenic. So it's not just the blood sugar related problems, but the insulin related problems. And the people making those arguments made pretty compelling arguments. So if you're a type 1 diabetic, you know, what's interesting, again, is they never do the study. So you've got these complications that come up. People develop new insulins. New insulins create complications of their own. Maybe they're longer lasting and you're more likely to get hypoglycemia, or they're faster acting. They test the insulins, they test oral medications, they never test dietary approaches. And the very first person we know of in history who tested his own blood sugar regularly at home as opposed to urine was Richard Bernstein of the Bernstein's Diabetic Solution. So Bernstein's got an engineering degree. He's a smart guy. He's working for his father's medical equipment company, and he gets a hold of a blood sugar monitor because that are, you know, being used in emergency rooms. They're, you know, yay big. And he starts testing his blood sugar at home, and he designs a diet to minimize his blood sugar. And his idea that the law of low doses, he calls it, the less insulin you use and the less carbs you consume, most likely the healthiest you'll be. And it seems to make enormous sense, but nobody ever tests it. Nobody says, let's see if this is true. Let's see if the effect it has on patients with type 1 diabetes is so beneficial that they're willing to accept this kind of program, more so than their liberal. You know, I saw Travis, Dr. Sansom was one of the people pushing for the liberal diet. They just never test it. They never get around to testing it. So it always stays a fringe diet. To me, it makes an enormous amount of sense if you want to maximize your health. Some people don't.
I can tell you from being in this community, and I do this meeting every day, so I've been exposed to thousands upon thousands of interactions, and we have type 1 diabetics who are basically on essentially, some of them have completely are not taking insulin anymore, which is very controversial to say, but I've got 4 or 5 of them I've interviewed and I've talked with and looked at their numbers, and routinely have hemoglobin A1Cs in the 4.5 range. And so it's, you know, and on just a minimal amount of diabetic meds. So it's kind of interesting.
Yeah, no, the numbers are amazing. Actually, what I would like to recommend to you, so when I talk about how the nutrition research community, to me, you know, the epilogue of good calories, bad calories, I said it's not a real science, right? It's like a faux science, or they don't really care. They pretend, they wear white lab coats, they get funding, they do experiments, maybe they even wear goggles in the lab, you know, and they look like scientists, and they act like they pretend that they're scientists, but they don't actually do science. So, you know, a fundamental belief in the nutrition community is if you don't get your vitamin C's from plants, you're going to die of scurvy, right? So all you guys are supposed to be dead. Somebody should be studying you. Just like they studied, remember the famous experiment with Stefansson and then Anderson and at Bellevue, and, you know, and the predictions were they're going to die of scurvy. And when they didn't, they published papers about it. So you guys are supposed to be dead. If you're near a local university, you should say, go to the nutritionist and say, look, I'm supposed to be dead. I eat nothing but meat. I don't appear to be dead. You should be interested in this phenomena. This is completely, if nothing else, it's a kind of anomalous observation that makes people rethink their, you know, scientific theories about how the human body works. And the fact that they haven't come to you to say, you know, we'd really, anyone, I mean, there must be thousands, anyone should say, I would like to understand carnivore, because these people are, maybe you're taking vitamin C and not telling us. I don't know, maybe you're even telling people to take vitamins.
Yeah, I mean, there is a, as you may know, I know, well, David Ludwig is actually, there's a kind of an observational study that he and Belinda Leonards has done on this community. We got about 2,000 people that participated in that study, which is just basically a survey. And then we are actually funding an interventional trial of ourselves on our own, because we're like, no one else wants to study it. We want to get it published. So we're doing well with that. So that'll happen, whether some outside researcher wants to study us. I know we'd have volunteers that'd be happy to be studied, and if not, we'll do it ourselves. So that's at least going to happen for
Well, this is what, I would like them to do it just to prove that they're, the absolute first characteristic anyone has to have to become a scientist is curiosity. Why aren't they curious? I'm curious, And again, I make this point in the new book, in the Case for Keto. One of the fundamental flaws in this community is a lack of curiosity. So, they say people get fat because they eat too much. And if you're gaining, 5 pounds of fat a year, that's 30 calories extra a day, 40 calories too much a day. Why don't people eat less by 40 calories? That's not a lot. That's 3 bites of food. That's a question. That's curious. Like, I think this person, my neighbor, got fatter over the past 15 years because he ate 40 calories too much every day. Why? Why didn't he stop it? He doesn't want to be fat. All kinds of questions. And why are carnivores still alive? Why aren't you all dead of scurvy? Maybe.
Well, and if you go back historically, as you probably know, the polar explorers figured that out, that it was, meat was anti-scorbutic, and
Well, it's not that the meat is anti-scorbutic. It's that because I actually, when I was doing good calories, bad calories, I got to know a fellow here at Berkeley. I now live out a mile from where I used to live, who was the world's leading authority on deficiency diseases, and he'd written like 3 books on them. And I was reading all the polar explorer literature, and I called him up and I said, look, it seems like they fall into 2 groups. They're the ones whose boats sink and they get trapped in the Arctic and they have to live on Inuit food and they do fine. And they're the ones whose boats sink and they rescue their stores and they get trapped in the Arctic and they live on Inuit food and crackers and biscuits and they get scurvy. So are there exceptions to this rule? Is it possible that because the carbs increase the need for B vitamins and because the carbs compete with vitamin C for uptake into cells, that there's plenty of vitamin C in the animal products, certainly enough? Doesn't make sense that our ancestors had to occasionally eat a blueberry and they'd get scurvy. And that the scurvy is caused by not having green. It's not a vitamin C deficiency disease. It's a vitamin C deficiency in relative to the carbohydrate content of the diet. You think of the experiment that the original scurvy experiment, I forget the guy's name, on the boat, the British, that got the Brits to be called limeys. They were eating a carb-rich diet made of basically refined crap carbohydrates and getting scurvy. And in that kind of diet, you have to add plants or fruits. If you're only eating meat, you're not eating the carbs, you don't. So I don't think it's that the meat is anti-scorbutic so much as that the carbs, and there's copious evidence for the needing more vitamin B when you're eating a carb-rich diet and the competition of vitamin C into cells when your blood sugar is elevated.
There, it's interesting. There's also, if you look at rickets, there's studies on these Greenland Inuits, 2 different populations, one eating traditional diet plus flour, sugar, and canned goods. And guess which one got rickets?
Yeah. Well, that's exactly. So it's sort of like, it's not so much that the traditional diet protects them, but that the whatever's in the untraditional diet.
We saw the same thing with beriberi, thiamine deficiency, same sort of situation. High carb diets predispose them to thiamine deficiency, even though the serum levels were the same. So I thought that's just fascinating that there's.
Well, that's the thing. The beriberi, they go from basically there's that famous experiment with the Japanese sailors, where they go from eating, they get beriberi eating white rice. And whatever else they were eating, and then they switch them to brown rice, and they don't get beriberi because their blood sugar is staying lower. They're not metabolizing the carbs as much. They don't need as much vitamin B. So, but again, these are the kind of studies you and I know what the nutrition community doesn't. They're just, and the dietitians don't. They're just taught dogma, and then they're supposed to go and preach the dogma.
That's true. Gary, I've got to go to LAX to pick up somebody, but let me ask you, where's people going to go to find your book? How do they get hold of it? Where is it? I'm sure it's like Amazon and the usual channels. Or what's
yeah, I mean, if there's an independent bookstore near you, it'll be available on Tuesday at you're in December 29th at your independent bookstore, which I think should be supported. Otherwise, Amazon, I do think it's worth reading. I really tried to put all of this in perspective. Like I said, originally it was, how to get people to think about this right. And the physicians I interviewed, there's some really, really smart people out there who have, interesting thoughts about how to do this. Actually, my favorite was, I don't want to keep you from picking up your friend, but something Carrie Doulis said to me. So Carrie's a spine surgeon in Ohio, and she doesn't believe her body can tolerate animal foods. So over the years, she's become a vegan, but she eats a vegan ketogenic diet, and she tells her patients to eat animal foods if they can, if they don't have ethical issues. And she said to me, it's not a religion, it's just about how I feel.
Well, I'll tell you, she messaged me about 3 months ago and said she's incorporated animal foods back in her diet.
Oh,
so there's an update to that in case you didn't know. So.
I'm glad she did. It's interesting because but this is ultimately, that's what I tried to communicate in the book. We do this way because the conventional thinking didn't work for us. And most of us had gone through periods where we tried mostly plant diets and vegetarian diets. Some of the doctors I interviewed had been vegans. It didn't work. Like my, former colleague, Peter Attia, he had gone through a period of, vegetarian diet, and it didn't make him leaner or healthier. Maybe it does some people, and then they stop there. I tried to find people for whom a ketogenic diet worked, but a vegan or vegetarian diet worked better, but those people don't tend to talk to me. But I would love to hear from them and understand their experience.
And before we go, I wanted to ketogenic diets, the sort of the party line, the sort of the mainstream party line on that, they're okay for a temporary weight loss, but they're not sustainable and they're going to kill you over the years. Where in the heck is the data that shows it's going to kill you over the years? And,
well, that's the observational epidemiology. That's why when Good Calories, Bad Calories came out, I had an article in the New York Times Magazine, a cover story on the problems with observational epidemiology, because that is a pseudoscience in the sense that it's part of a science. It generates a hypothesis. When you do these cohort studies, like the Nurses' Health Study, you identify 130,000 nurses, and then you ask them what they eat, and you get their health status, and the ones that are healthy, you follow them forward, and you see who stays healthy and who gets sick. And the ones who stay healthy tend to be the ones who eat mostly plants and get their protein and fat from plant food sources. So they're the health conscious ones. They're the ones who listen to your dietary advice that was being given when the study started. And now your hypothesis is they're healthier because they eat mostly plants. So the association is they do eat mostly plants. That generates a hypothesis that's why they're healthier. Those studies never get done, as we discussed, because those are expensive, complicated studies, are easy to screw up, so you never do the studies. So what the nutrition public health community decided to do was to believe those hypotheses were true, or so likely to be true, that people who eat like us are going to kill ourselves because we don't eat mostly plants, and we eat a lot of saturated fat and red meat and processed meat. So we're up against hypotheses, and all we've got in return is our personal experience. When we eat like this, we seem to get healthier. Our risk factors improve. If we're diabetic, we get off our drugs, our medications. So one of the points that was made to me by a South African physician who works in Canada, just north of Vancouver, a guy named Martin Andre, he said, as a doctor, we're supposed to prescribe diet by hypothesis, right? I tell you to eat a low-fat, mostly plant diet, and my hypothesis is you'll live longer. You don't get thinner. maybe your LDL comes down, your triglycerides stay high, your HDL stays low, your blood sugar stays out of control. So I put you on drugs from all that. Your blood pressure stays high. I put you on drugs. But my hypothesis is, right, we're minimizing heart disease. You're going to live longer. If I put you on some version of keto, I can watch you get healthy. My observation, the experience is you get healthier. But the hypothesis based on these observational studies over 20 years is we're all going to die. It would be nice if they'd test that.
I don't disagree with the fact that we're all going to die.
Yeah, now we're all going to die prematurely because of how we eat.
All right, Gary. Well, thank you so much. I got to run. Appreciate the interview. Good luck with the book. I'm looking forward to reading it myself, and look forward to running into you in person again sometime when people are allowed to actually, look at and shake each other's hands again. So anyway, have a great day and a great new year, Gary. Take care.
You too. Thank you. Thank you all. Take care.
Take care, everybody. See you guys tomorrow. Bye-bye now.